Thank you, Dedri, for that beautiful song. All it takes is one to heal the world. And that's what we are about here in our current Lenten series, where we are talking about healing. And we are talking about each of us contributing our part to gather the light together so that we can experience healing. We've begun with healing of ourselves, physical healing, mental healing, intellectual healing we have talked about. We've talked about healing within community, and today we're moving to healing of our planet. And so I'm excited to be here and share this message with you today. As I've been doing, I'm going to start with some scripture, and this is again a healing story coming from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 8, verses 18 through 27. When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. Then a teacher of the law came and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." Then he got into a boat and his disciples followed him, and suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, "Lord, save us, we're going to drown." He replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, "What kind of a man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." And again, that's coming from the Gospel of Matthew. So you may know that in Unity, what we do with Scripture is we metaphysically interpret the Scriptures, which simply means that we take a look at what is the idea standing under those words that speak to us today. How can we take the message here within this Scripture and find a word for ourselves today? And so here is this teacher of the law who comes up to Jesus and says, "I will follow you wherever you go." I mean, think about that idea for a moment. Have I made that kind of a commitment? Christ, I will follow you wherever you go. It's a big commitment. And Jesus seems to point out to that Christ points out to that when he says, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Where will following that Christ take us on our journey? That idea that we as human beings, which is the word there, Son of Man, that was translated, it just simply means a human being. We have nowhere to rest our head. What does that mean for you and for me? And as I think about it, I think of all of the ways that perhaps you, we look out into the world looking for that place that will give us security, comfort, protection. And I think that Christ's Spirit is reminding us in this particular passage that we will not find it looking out at the world out there. As soon as we think that we have grasped that which will give us comfort, that will give us security, life changes again. And we find ourselves again seeking for that which will provide us with it. And Christ reminds us, if you follow me, you will discover that there is nowhere in the world that will give you that. Come, follow me. And then, of course, the very odd one with the disciple who says, "First let me go and bury my father," and Jesus says, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." And obviously this isn't literal. I mean, literally, the dead are not going to bury their dead. So what does this statement have to say to us when we look at it metaphysically? We all carry in our mind our stories and ideas of past. We sometimes cling to these stories. Sometimes we believe that these stories that we carry with us make us who we are. We argue for these stories that no longer serve us, but that we use to define ourselves. And we get stuck there, stuck in regrets, stuck in victimhood, stuck in blame. And that Christ's Spirit invites us to let those thoughts go. Let those stories go. Let those stories bury themselves. Come, follow me. And then, of course, he goes with the disciples into the boat. And Jesus, as the Christ, just goes to sleep. And the storm is tossing that boat. Now, I don't know about you, but if I were in a little boat in a storm sleeping, that would probably wake me up. But Jesus is there, sound asleep. The disciples, so afraid. Wake up, we're going to drown. And again, Jesus says, what is it? What are you so afraid of? Peace. In another gospel, I think it's Mark, the same story, he says, peace, be still to that storm. And the storm is stilled. How many times have I woken up in the middle of the night with the storms of my life going around and tossing and turning me to the point where I can't go back to sleep and I'm filled with worry and stress and anxiety, and then I'm reminded, come, follow me. Center once more in that divine Christ Spirit within you. Find your place of peace, and then the storms in your life can still. In this scripture, as we think about the planet, as we think about the earth, what I want to bring us to is this idea of Jesus calming the seas. You know, we have this idea that we are here, it's told to us in Genesis, that we have dominion over the earth, power over the earth. That idea of dominion over the earth, if you look up the word dominion in the dictionary, it says sovereignty, to have power over, to rule over. And that's the way, for the most part, we have taken it. But if you look at the Hebrew word that was translated there as dominion, the word there is radah. And looking at that meaning, what does that word in the Hebrew mean? It means literally to come down and walk with. What a different idea than to rule over, but instead to walk with. To realize that we are not separate from the earth. We are not separate from nature, but that we are walking with nature. And in fact, we are one with nature. The idea that we are to rule over nature, rule over the earth, has created so many misperceptions. And then add to that the fall from the garden, and there is a great majority of people who believe that we are living here upon this fallen earth. But unity doesn't teach that. Unity teaches and knows that that power and presence that we call God, divine mind, Christ consciousness, is here within all creation. How could it be anything but? And that within the earth, we can discover that unity, that oneness with all life. How arrogant it truly is to believe that I am separate from the earth. I mean, just think about that for a moment. Like me, you might tend to think about the earth as the ground we walk on. But the earth is this whole system with the atmosphere and oxygen, and then the ground below me, and everything growing from the ground, and everything moving upon the earth. And it is one big system, a whole. And you are a part of that. How could it be anything but? As I breathe in the air and release the carbon dioxide out. You know, the lungs of our planet, the trees, breathe in that carbon dioxide and transfer it back to air that it breathes out, that I now breathe in. I could not exist without that process that happens. The earth is, the majority of what's there is water. The majority of what is in my body is water. It's said we can live, I think it's 3 weeks without food. We can only live 3 days without water. Water is a necessity because it's most of what I am here in this body. And when I take and drink that cup of water, well, where does the water of the earth end and I begin now? I can't exist without it. We are interconnected with this planet, with the earth. And then the food that we eat, that is also coming from the earth. Again, when I eat that grain within my piece of bread, where does that grain that was planted in the earth that grew and was harvested, where does that end and I begin? We cannot tell that. Everything is beautifully, intimately, intricately connected. And I am a part of that. You are a part of that. We are a part of nature, not separate from, but one with. Not dominion over, but walking with and among. And this idea that we have had dominion over our resources has created an unhealthiness within our planet and within the way in which we live. With the start of the Industrial Revolution, with the increase of capitalism, with the increase of consumerism, we have looked at the resources of the earth as something that we can exploit and use for our purposes. And so we can look at a tree and not see a tree. We can look at a forest and not see the living lungs of the planet. We look at these things and we inquire, I wonder how much that would be worth when I cut that down. And we use resources in unhealthy ways. You know, there's a conversation about the changes in the climate that are happening right now. Well, of course the climate is changing. Nothing upon our planet stays the same, so we know that our climate changes all the time. There's evidence of that. I live in Hinckley where, I've walked Hinckley ledges where there's a sign that reminds me that these ledges were once at the bottom of a sea. There's sea fossils found in those rocks. Clearly, the climate has changed over the millions of years that the earth has been here. We move in and out of these changes, and we are, of course, going through changes now. The argument comes about as to whether or not we as human beings have had an impact on those changes. Have we supported health and wholeness, or have we, through our dominion over, created a unhealthiness within our planet? For me, I need only think about the earth as a system again. And I think about my own body, which is in and of itself a system. And I contribute to the health of my body system when I eat things that are healthy for my body, when I take the time to exercise, when I take the time to get good sleep. That all supports a healthy body. Now, I could get plenty of sleep. I could get plenty of exercise. But if I made a change and said, I really like sweets, and so from this point on, I'm just going to eat sweet things because that just tastes so good. And if in that moment I began to just eat stuff that was sweet and didn't bring in the healthy foods that my body needs, my body would suffer from that one single, simple change. And so when I think about the planet, and I think about the wholeness of that system, I think, how could one thing not change that system? And we're not talking about something little, we're talking about something big, the impact that we as human beings have upon this planet. So I wanted to share some of those thoughts with you. In the past 50 years, humans have consumed more resources than in all previous history. Think about that. In the entire history of humankind, we consumed a certain amount of resources. And in the past 50 years, we've consumed more resources than all of that previous time. That's a statistic that comes from the U.S. EPA in 2009. U.S. consumption grew sixfold between 1960 and 2008, and the U.S. population only grew by a factor of 2.2. And so what that means is that between 1960 and 2008, our human consumption has nearly tripled. It's not surprising. We're taught to be consumers. We're taught, remember those scriptures, to look out in the world for those things that will help us to feel secure, help us to feel happy when Jesus and the Christ is inviting us to remember to come follow me. You will not find it out in the world. We're taught to be good consumers. We're taught that the earth is there for us to be used. We are, at this moment, science tells us, in the biggest mass extinction of species since the dinosaurs. More and more species are going extinct today. Nearly half of the world's forests have been burned or cleared or converted to non-forest uses. Remember, again, those forests are the lungs of our planet. I remember when Gary and I went and visited the Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica a few years ago, walking through that with a naturalist, showing us one tree, and telling us there are 240 species that rely on that one tree to survive, and that tree that relies on those species to survive. It's all interconnected, and half of the world's forests have been burned or cleared or converted to non-forest uses. According to, and by the way, those all came from ecocycle.org, if you wanted to go look those up, ecocycle.org. NASA also has a lot of information on their website because they have that perspective of being able to view this beautiful jeweled planet from the perspective of space, right? And so they can see things. They say on the NASA website that there is greater than a 95% probability that what we are experiencing is a result of human activity since the mid-20th century. Global temperatures have risen about 2.12 degrees since the late 19th century. The ocean has heated up 0.6 degrees Fahrenheit. The sheets of ice, Greenland and Antarctica, have decreased in mass. Again, observing it from space, they can see that. Greenland lost an average of 279 billion tons of ice per year between 1993 and 2019. Glaciers are retreating, including in the Alps, the Himalayas, the Andes, the Rockies, Alaska, Africa. Satellite observations reveal that the amount of spring snow cover in the northern hemisphere has decreased over the past 5 decades, and that snow is melting earlier. The sea levels globally have risen by 8 inches in the last century. Both the extent and thickness of Arctic sea ice has declined rapidly over the last century. And the acidity of the surface ocean waters has increased by 30%. This is the result, from my perspective, of this idea that the earth is there for us to use. And as industrialization has increased, it becomes an exploitation of those resources on our planet to serve us. And we've reached this critical point. A point in which even many religions are now saying we need to make some changes and rearrange our understanding. Come, follow me. the Christ says. There's a new theology called eco-theology, in which theologians are looking at Scripture and seeing throughout there how it speaks about that power and presence that is God, that is within all creation. How do we honor that when we see nature and only think about what it's worth from a material perspective? How can we shift from that into an honoring of that divine power and presence within all creation? If you were here in Unity Hall, I would likely have been asking you, where do you experience the divine? Where do you experience the divine? And I've asked that often enough to know what your answers are. Oh, I experience the divine when I see a sunrise or a sunset. I experience the divine as I sit on the beach and listen to the waves lapping upon the shore. I experience the divine as I go for a walk out in nature, as I see those spring flowers popping back up again through the earth. I experience the divine in nature. So we know that there is that which is sacred within nature. And yet, we continue to exploit that nature. Unity, several years ago, created the Earth Care Ministry. Unity Spiritual Center engaged in the Earth Care Ministry for the first time the year before we shut down. It's kind of on hold right now until we're back. But this is what the Unity movement says about the sacredness of the earth. The Unity movement is guided by a vision of sacredness and the interconnectedness of all, the interdependence of all life. It is a journey of spiritual relationships with earth and its creatures. It is through awakened consciousness that we see everything as the presence of God. As humanity has been primarily responsible for climate change, we affirm that it will be humanity which will co-create a vision of the environmentally conscious use of energy and our planet's fragile resources. We joyfully participate in our God-given role as good stewards of the earth. Through prayer, meditation, church, or spiritual center-inspired activities, and the skillful use of media, we affirm that the Unity movement is a world leader in advancing the growth of environmental consciousness and right action. There's much doomsday talk about where we're at, that we're at this critical moment. Is it too late? Can we change things? I don't know the answer to that. I don't know what kind of a planet we are going to be leaving behind for my granddaughter who's 5 today. I don't know. But I find hope in the understanding that I can follow that Christ Spirit, that I can find peace in my thoughts, that I can center in understanding, that I can center in my wisdom, and that from that I can ask, what is mine to do? What is mine to do? I go back to Dedry's song, It Takes One. It takes you and I to take one action at a time to begin to turn it around. It takes us to decide that we will no longer see the natural resources as something that we can exploit, something that I deserve to experience, but instead to begin to see the sacredness of life. What does that look like for you? What does that look like for me? We can only each decide individually. Even as I'm speaking now, I'm remembering a story. Oh, this goes back probably 20 years. And there was an individual, Tizak, a Mayan priest, who had this beautiful, gorgeous piece of property in Pennsylvania. And we went often to participate in his teachings and his rituals, and we helped him. We helped him to build a sweat lodge one year out of stones collected from his grounds. And there was an area that he was hoping to clear so that people could come and camp. And Gary, my husband, having a chainsaw, said, "I'll be there, we'll help." And I remember him starting that chainsaw, and all of a sudden Tizak coming, running, saying, "Stop, stop. We have to ask the tree first whether it's okay to cut it down." You know, to my Western mind, that sounds crazy. What? Ask the tree? And yet, have you experienced the presence of a tree? Have you felt its healing energy? Have you recognized the divine within it? Have you honored it for that sanctity that it is? These are the questions that we'll be asking this week as we practice health for our environment and how we can each contribute to that. So our spiritual practice this week reminds us that the words of Jesus that we highlighted this week was, "Follow me and let the dead bury their dead." This may seem like harsh words, and yet we hear Jesus' urgency. Now is the time to move. No matter how difficult, we cannot wait. What is past is past. There is brokenness and there are casualties in its wake, but we can move forward. What is one way that you can move forward this week to contribute to the healing of our earth home?